Hey everybody, Alex Weisman here. We are in week 9, looking at democracy and education beyond the school age. So thinking about what democracy and education looks like, not just outside of school, but when the individuals involved are adults or are beyond sort of regular or typical school age, as we have referred to it in the past. And it's an interesting question to ask because when we talk about democracy and education, we're all often thinking about the formal education system. And this gives us an opportunity to think about what is education like out in the broader community and what representation is there among different groups, or what rights and responsibilities do adults have when it comes to education and developing their sort of democratic citizenship or whatever that might mean. You had 2 readings from this week, and I will share this part of my screen with you. So 2 readings this week, one from Amy Gutman looking at chapter 9 on educating adults. That was the required reading. And then if you wanted to, you could look at Abrego's, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, Relational Legal Consciousness of U.S. Citizenship, Privilege, Responsibility, Guilt, and Love in Latino Mixed Status Families. And what's interesting, I think, about these 2 readings is that it gives us the opportunity to consider what it is about education that might be unique or different beyond the actual formal schooling atmosphere. And so I wanted to see if I can do this. I wanted to just think through a couple things with you. And I'm going to use the board to do this. So one of the things that I think is a really big question that goes along with this idea of education beyond the school age is back to who is a citizen. Because if we're thinking about what rights and responsibilities someone has to education when they're out of or not even eligible for sort of the traditional K-12 schooling that would have been either compulsory or government sponsored or supported, when they were of school age. But once you're an adult, then we have to think of, who's a citizen. And one of the ways that we could think about it is they're a community member. One of the ways that we could think about it is that they are a community member in the political sense, or the social sense, or the economic sense. I'm sure there are more senses that we could think of, but those are sort of the big 3 that come up. When we're talking about political, when we could think of voting and sort of what we call democratic participation. We could also think of, basically being a law-abiding citizen, whatever that might mean. So this is a really important part of our conversation to think of, who is a citizen, and using that as a way to start thinking about who gets access to education, and in particular, how is democracy and education being thought of beyond the school age. But if we don't understand what part of the community the member belongs to, then I think it's hard to think about what's the democratic element of this. Like, how does democracy play a role in education? Now, I know when we get into Gutman in particular, and I'll limit my discussion to Gutman because that was the only required reading for this week. Gutman talks a lot about what the government should provide individuals so that they can be good citizens in a democracy. And she talks about cultural opportunities. She talks about higher education for adults, and she talks about primary education for adults. And we're going to get to all of that. But I really wanted to spend some time talking about what it means to be a citizen, first of all. And in order to do that, we have to think about this community involvement, or what part of this is relevant to our discussion about adults education, and democracy. So a political community member is a really important first part of this because it determines whether or not we are talking about formal democratic participation in terms of, for example, voting. Voting is often a big part of that. And it also goes back to it's something that might not be part of the formal citizenship in terms of I'm a citizen, I have a passport for this particular country, but it has to do with being a law-abiding citizen. So making sure that or ensuring that people understand their roles and responsibilities related to the state. And so maybe I should make that here. This is related to state. And by state, I mean, the government, if that's readable. All right, the next part of this is the social community. And that could literally be I'm going to use the word community again here. That could be the community or the neighborhood or the, I'm going to use the word affinity group, meaning that there are groups that people can belong to that may not be location based, but maybe they're around a particular religion, or maybe they're around an ethnicity, or maybe they're related to a particular, interest in a hobby or a particular ideology or something like that. We also want to think about what are the obligations to a community. So if you are a member of a social community, do you have rights and responsibilities for that or to that community in the same way that you would, let's say, if you were a political citizen? So you have a right, and we could argue that you have a right and rights as well as responsibilities related to democratic participation. One of those rights is voting. One of the responsibilities, quite frankly, is also voting. But we want to think about what is the social membership or citizenship component, and what does that look like if we're talking about democracy and education for adults. And maybe this is where also the culture part of this comes in. I hope that shows up. Yeah, culture. If we're talking about culture as an additional element of this, then if we're talking about culture, and according to the way Amy Gutman was mentioning it, she was talking a lot about sort of high culture. Like she talked about opera a lot. But I'm thinking more in terms of traditions, values, ideologies, things like that, norms, values. So let's think of when we think about obligations to a community, let's use those terms: norms, values, and behaviors. So there can be aspects of culture or the social community that might be related to norms. Like there are certain ways that we behave in this community. In the Western world, it's often very individualistic. In other parts of the world, it's often more communal or community oriented rather than focusing on the needs of the individual only. But we want to be able to certainly understand and start to talk about what this looks like. All right. For economic citizenship, we often hear about productivity. That can be in terms of labor market. I'm going to use LM for labor market participation. In other words, you have a job. We could talk about it in terms of income. We could also talk about it in terms of spending or reinvestment. And then we can also think about just sort of broader economic contributions to the community. Those certainly could be spending and investment, as we've listed here, but it could also be contributions related to creating an environment where economic productivity is supported. So making sure that technology is valued, making sure that there is an infrastructure that's in place that allows, like roads and internet and things like that, that would allow economic citizenship to sort of flourish and for the community to benefit from that. So we're talking about, just so we don't all forget, we want to make sure that democracy and education are highlighted in each of these areas. So what would it look like for democracy and education to intersect around the idea of political citizenship? This one right here. Would it mean that education, whatever that looks like, would help facilitate the political citizenship of individuals? In other words, if there was an adult that was not a member of the local citizenry, it wasn't, let's say, was an immigrant, since that's a topic that you're addressing a lot in this class, who was an adult in the community, did not have US citizenship, could they still be a political member or a political citizen of their community without formal citizenship? I mean, that's a whole topic for discussion there. On the sort of just strict level, the answer is no. Without formal citizenship, you cannot vote, you cannot participate in the sort of official political democratic process at that level. You could still be involved in the discussion. You could still you could still advocate for candidates. You could still advocate for or against a particular legislation. You just couldn't actually be a voting participant in that. You couldn't run for office, things like that. But you could be a law-abiding citizen, meaning that your rights and responsibilities would involve understanding what the laws are, what the regulations are for your community, and making sure that you are participating in that in a way that is, according to the expectations or according to the laws. And there could be some educative process that would help you understand what that is. Now, one of the questions that Amy Gutman asks in her chapter is the government responsible for providing or supporting education for adults that leads to whatever these outcomes are? If it's political citizenship, is the government responsible in the United States for providing, let's use this group again, for providing immigrants with the understanding of the pathway to citizenship and sort of what it means to be a citizen of the United States? Is that something that should be provided by the government? And if so, how would it be provided? That's kind of a key question. Would it be sort of there's a compulsory learn about citizenship program? Would it be that there are public information sessions that are voluntary that people could either come to or access information online about this? Or is it something that is just, it's out there, and if somebody wants to find out more, they can, but it's not necessarily required, and it's certainly not formalized in terms of the way it's provided. Next, we can talk about social or cultural community. And again, what is the role that democracy and education plays in terms of in terms of developing a social or cultural community member or community citizenship? Again, if we're going to use Amy Gutman as our example, we're thinking about, is the government, who provides most formal education from the K through 12 age area, is the government responsible for supporting the development of social and cultural citizenship? Well, that could be in terms of, let's say, maybe the government provided some sort of adult education program that was through a community center, or that was part of a neighborhood effort. It might be local government that's involved, maybe more than federal government or state government in this situation, or maybe there would be funding for that sort of thing that's provided by the government that would help individuals identify their community, align with them, and sort of learn what the requirements were or the obligations were to being a part of that community in good standing moving forward. And then finally, we want to think about economic citizenship and whether or not the education system or the government, through some sort of educational activity or organization or arm or branch, needs to be preparing, we'll use immigrants again as our example, preparing immigrants to enter the labor market or preparing them for income generation, and especially upward mobility. In other words, prepare them for higher paying jobs or higher status jobs or things like that. Should the government be providing adults, whether they're immigrants or not, with information about spending and investment? In other words, some sort of a budget at the most basic level, education, budgeting. How do you budget for a family? How do you budget when you're on a limited income? How do you budget when you've got too much income? I mean, it could go both ways. Or how do you invest in not only yourself, but your family, so that there's a return on that investment economically, as well as maybe socially or politically. And then finally, maybe there should be some sort of a program from the government on how do you be a part of the contributions that the community makes or that the context makes to the development of individuals, in particular, maybe those who have not had the same opportunities through their home environment or through their socioeconomic status that's part of their normal background, to develop their economic citizenship. So all of these things have these different ideas for adult education come in the form of, let's say, special programs, they come in terms of funding, resources, or support. Maybe it's a grant. They come in terms of both maybe required or compulsory, as well as volunteer or optional, as well as, I'm going to say, passive opportunities. That's when there's information that's available, but someone has to want it, and then they have to look for it in order to find it. Okay. These special programs are overt. In other words, there would be a specific adult education program about how do you become a US citizen, that sort of thing. Okay, so all of these are part of the conversation about what it takes to be a not only a citizen, but what does democracy and education look like for adults, sort of beyond the traditional realm, so to speak. I'm going to erase, write some more here. Okay, so we're left with these questions, well, a couple of key questions. One is, what does the government provide? And again, that is formally and overtly. Maybe it's compulsory. That is optional or voluntary, but it's still a formal program. And then that is passive. It's informal It's certainly not required. Right, so what does the government provide in terms of education for adults so that they can learn how to be democratic participants in the political, socio-cultural, and economic communities that they live in? Now, this also brings us to questions about how is adult, I'm just gonna write it out, how is adult citizenship, whatever that looks like, or whichever type of citizenship we're talking about, linked to social, political, and economic mobility? Big question there, actually. How is adult citizenship linked to social, political, and economic mobility? Well, it's a good question for us. And it also harkens back to our framing question for this week, which is, how do democracy and education intersect beyond school age, which is a much broader question. But I think if we're thinking about, what does the government provide and how does adult citizenship link to social, political, and economic mobility, then we're on the right track, because we can start to think of what are the outcomes of democracy and education. What does that look like for adults? So one of the things that I may have mentioned earlier in this course or in a previous discussion was that education in the United States was originally proposed as a mass education system, a system that brought in individuals at an unprecedented level, not just the elite males, but now male and female from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, from all different races or ethnicities are part of the education system in the United States. And part of that is because a rationale throughout the education system in the US, and I would argue the world, in fact, there's evidence for this worldwide, is that education is preparation for being a citizen, or is a way to incorporate people into citizenship in a particular community, nation, state, whatever it might be. So if that's one of the fundamental and originally one of the primary purposes of education, then our look at Amy Gutmann becomes even more important. So I'm going to share the screen. You should be seeing chapter 9 with some highlighting. Hopefully that's all there for you. What I would like to point out is that she also asks, what should the role of government be in supporting cultural opportunities for adults, higher education for adults who want it, and primary education for adults who need it? So her questions are a little different than the questions I was just asking, but we'll try to tie them together here. So the first one, what should the role of government be in, let's just say, education for adults, and leave it there, or learning for adults? So that goes back to the question that I just had on the board. What does the government provide? Is it formal and overt? Is it optional, voluntary, but also formally available? Or is it passive and it's informal? So it's some sort of a explicit program on, how to be a better citizen, or how to become a US citizen, or how to, what are the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, that sort of thing. Versus an optional thing, which might be the same content, but it would be something that was available, if you wanted to attend, or it was online, and if you click through it, you could get to it, and there would be some provision of understanding that was available, like you would be made aware, adults would be made aware that this kind of information was available to them. There would also be the stuff then that was available just on the website somewhere, or if you went to the library and looked for it, you could find it, or if you hunted down somebody who had personal knowledge, you could ask them about it. Okay, so one of the things that Amy Gutmann points out right off the bat, which I think is an important one, and we'll spend a little time with her in her culture discussion, is when she says right there at the beginning of the chapter on page 256, democratic societies can consciously reproduce themselves by providing cultural opportunities for adults as well as children. And then she talks about what liberal theorists claim. So democratic societies can consciously reproduce themselves. That is really important. So if the United States is a democratic society, one of the goals of education, whether it be K-12 formal education, or it be education that's provided less formally or maybe more voluntarily to adults by the government, would be geared towards reproducing this democratic society. And that's kind of the key. If it really is a democratic society, then it will probably reproduce itself. If it is not so much a democratic society, but maybe it's more of a capitalist society, or maybe it's more of a hierarchical, dominant, power dominant society with a democratic, flair to it, then maybe it reproduces the segregation and the power dominance. And then the democratic part of it is window dressing. It is something that we maybe do as part of our day-to-day activities, or something that we expect, but it doesn't really run the way that we interact, the way that the community works. And we have this question about whether or not the government should be providing education for adults, or whether it should be by private, not public authorities. And then Gutman has a whole section here, and this is where she talks about opera a lot, about very high culture. She's talking about opera and museums and other sorts of things. And should this be the kind of culture that that the government not only provides, but provides in a way that is equitable and overtly so? And there's some disagreement. Rawls, who I think you had the opportunity to read from in a previous week, would argue no, that there needs to be less public involvement and more private involvement, or at least needs to be a little more balanced. But you could also make the argument that in order to provide an equitable or a democratic context or opportunity for all adults, then kind of every facet of being a citizenship should be equitably available to all the adults, whether they're formal US citizens or not. Maybe they're immigrants instead, or whether they're white or black or Hispanic or whatever their ethnic or racial background is, whether they speak English or not. I mean, there are lots of different ways that we could go into this. And that if we were going to provide it equitably, similar to how we provide it in the formal K-12 system, then there would need to be formalized, overt, or explicit efforts by the government to provide these different citizenship opportunities, or citizenshipizing, political incorporation or incorporation into a community opportunities that we've just talked about. What does the government provide in that conversation? If it is not, if that's not the responsibility of the government for adults, then maybe it's optional, or maybe it is passive. Okay. So for example, on page 265, still talking about culture, in an economically more egalitarian society, the audiences for high culture might be more representative of the general population than they are now, at least with regard to income, but such audiences would probably still be disproportionately well educated. And the argument here is that there are certain kinds of culture that appeal to certain communities. And where I think Amy Gutman loses part of the argument for me is that she can't seem to get off this high culture idea, which is very much dominated by white, upper middle, and upper class individuals or communities. And so I'm not sure that is the kind of culture that we want to use as an example of everyone should have equal access to it. Because there might be different types of culture that are equally valid, but might have different values that we wouldn't necessarily want to require everyone to participate in. And it might not make sense to provide opportunities for everyone to participate in. So as she's pointed out here, and I think she does more so in another, well, somewhere else in here, maybe it was in that paragraph I just went past. this part, is that, yeah, here it is. Poverty is the most common source of cultural discrimination and the source least amenable to correction by cultural institutions. But lowering admission prices to museums or making opera attendance compulsory is unlikely to increase attendance by the poor. That's really important because, and this is not what Gutman says, but what I would argue, because that is not the culture that is appropriate for or necessarily always aligned with people who are not part of high income white society. It might be, if we were harkening back to Pierre Bourdieu and we're talking about cultural capital, that might be the culture that gets you the most value, gets you access to the dominant group, but it might not be really the most equitable way to go about it. And this is going to make us think more of Lisa Delpit again, in terms of how do you learn to, live in your own community as well as the community of power? How do you learn to talk in your community as well as to, code switch and talk like you're a part of the community of power, whatever that community is? That's not necessarily what we're trying to do, or what the government's probably trying to promote in terms of developing democracy and citizenship for adults. Okay, we also have the idea of non-repression or non-discrimination. They come up again when Delpit is talking about educating adults. And the idea is, how much should the government be involved in order to ensure that there is not repression and that there's not discrimination in terms of the opportunities for access to citizenship, whether it be cultural, social, political, or economic, that adults might have, and what role does the government need to play in order to make sure that non-repression and non-discrimination are the sort of rule of law, so to speak. All right, the other thing that Gutman gets at is sort of the high end of education and then the basic elements of education. So access to higher education and access to basic literacy. And she takes sort of each in turn. I think she does it purposefully to look at each end of the spectrum to see what role or what responsibility the government has for providing equitable access to and opportunities for education at each of these levels. Again, formal education, but still education nonetheless. And she talks about, if we're going to talk about access to higher education for adults, we might be talking about alternative forms of access to higher education, or remediated forms of access to higher education, and even whether or not it would be valuable to have adults have access to higher education, because there's plenty of information available, especially now, which is, decades after Gutman was writing this, but especially now as we find, especially with the pandemic, that, not all jobs require a college degree in order to be successful at them. And there are specific groups that are trying to sort of put this out there, that people could be moving the labor market much more quickly and without as much debt if they would forego higher education. By the way, there's also a lot of evidence that shows when you have higher education, your income goes up dramatically. And there's a video that we might watch as part of our session this week that will suggest that, not suggest it, will show that. But all right, so should adults have access to higher education just because they are lacking it or because they need it? And is it something that should be available to all? Because it's not a government sponsored or formal compulsory part of the education system once people leave, high school. So there are a couple challenges that she points out. One is just simply that of access. So adults tend to have a lot more commitments in terms of jobs, family, other things that they're doing. And so they're not able to dedicate as much time to higher education, maybe as a traditional college age student would be. Although there are plenty of college age students with families and jobs. It's also an expensive proposition. It would cost the government a lot of money in order to provide that, because it is a situation where you don't really have a mass system in place. You have very much a much more privatized or selective situation in place. And so providing access for adults to higher education would be difficult, not only in terms of access, just straight up access, but funding it. And then finally, was the point that access to higher education for adults might not need to rest on traditional academic standards like test scores or how well you did as part of your high school, like the grades that you made, things like that. So there are ways that we could provide access to higher education. And Gutman gives an example of the Open University in the UK, which the only requirement for being admitted to the Open University is that you're an adult, and that it's been done very well, and it's provided a lot of opportunity for people. There are other countries also like Germany that provide very explicit and freely available formal education or continuing education for adults. It's especially used when people are either trying to sort of ramp up their skills or up their skill level or obtain competency certification for new demands in their current jobs, or they're trying to switch careers and retraining for another profession. All right, and then finally, Delpit talks about literacy programs and some of the problems with literacy. And this again brings us back around to Horace Mann, who was a very early advocate of mass schooling in the United States. Thomas Jefferson, also an early advocate of mass schooling in the United States, although a different version of mass schooling than we have now. But the idea that literacy is kind of fundamental, at least to those early promoters of mass education. Literacy is kind of fundamental to citizenship because you need to be able to read literature or information about what the rights and responsibilities are, or when there are changes to the legislation that's going through, or whatever it might be. But there are lots of arguments that citizenship is very key to democratic participation, and that it's very, very difficult to be a democratic participant in a formal political system, at least if you are not literate. And yet, I keep wanting to say Delpit, Gutman makes the argument very strongly that there are plenty of people who are active democratic participants in their political, social, and economic communities as adults who are still illiterate. And so the question is literacy required to be a citizen? Is it something that we should make compulsory for adults, that you must be literate? Well, I think Gutman ends by saying, no, not really, but it sure would be nice. I would back that up by saying there is a lot of evidence that shows that literate laborers or people who are in the labor market who are literate make higher income, have more mobility and status in their jobs than those who are illiterate. Those who are illiterate tend to be more active in terms of democratic political rights and responsibilities, so they vote more. They are more active in promoting or advocating for particular legislation or candidates. They're more active in contributing to their communities' overall political mobilization. And they also are more engaged with their community through social organizations, religious organizations, and other sorts of things. Okay, so that just sort of gives us a little tie into Gutman. I also would like to, for us to think about, and I'm going to go back to the screen here. I would like for us to think a little bit about how then we move to a more democratic education for adults and what that looks like. There we go. What that looks like if we're going to observe it. And I'm a big fan of graphs. So let's just use education and let's make it, I'll just say education. So down here is a little, down here or up here is a lot. I don't know what that means. And then we have to think of what this other axis is. Maybe it's citizenship. And what does that look like? You know what? I'm going to flip these axes. I think it'll make more sense. So on this axis, we'll have education, and we'll have little and lots. And on this axis, we'll have citizenship. And quite frankly, it's no and yes. Although I'm sure there are grades in there that we could, you can be more of a democratic participant in your community, even though you've got citizenship, or even though you don't. But there is, I'll use a different color. There is a yes-no divide. And if we wanted to also do this, we could, sort of say that there is a formal education and then post-formal, meaning after someone is school age. We can divide this into quadrants and think about this. So if we are, just going about our business, thinking about what does this look like, as someone sort of has more education in the formal system, then their ability to be or their potential outcome as a citizen probably goes up and up. Eventually they turn 18, they're able to vote, and maybe it just continues on up through this quadrant, right? So they're not citizens, but they have increasing formal education over time. In this lower left quadrant, it becomes more and more likely that they'll become a citizen over the course of their formal education. They eventually do become a citizen. Maybe this is all elementary and secondary education, and then this is higher ed here. And then formal schooling ends, and they've been a citizenship for a while because they became one sort of at this moment. Typically, if we're talking about just a regular, resident born in the US, when they turn 18, they're able to vote. They've been a citizen, I guess, the whole time, but they're able to be a democratically participating citizen. Maybe I should put that citizenship behavior as well. Up in this whole time, and then they become a voting member, and then they get, one would argue, they should continue to get more and more sort of bought into it, although it probably looks more like this. It's probably flattens out at some point, or it flattens, maybe it just stops like right here. And then there's no more that goes on after they become a citizen. What about the immigrant who comes into the United States with a fixed amount of formal education, probably a little, but not a lot. And then, so they would start here in the no quadrant with maybe a little, but not a lot. Now, what do they get? Well, we'd have to sort of skip them from here quickly up to here. I'm not sure they're getting any more formal education. They might get some as an adult, but the post-formal education would continue to maybe increase, and that could be compulsory, optional, or passive. I don't really know what the difference is because I'm just winging this as I'm thinking about what it looks like. But at some point, would they ever gain formal citizenship? Probably not. Probably not. So maybe it would look like this, but they'd never cross over into, they'd never cross this line. There are some people who will, formally seek out citizenship. Again, they might do this, and then I think it flattens out after that. But this is a way for us to think about what does citizenship look like and how can we start to observe it or measure it? What would it mean if someone came into our system with very little formal education, but they were seeking out other ways of, post-formally educating themselves about education, or maybe the government was providing voluntary programs, or if they provided a compulsory program, although I don't know of one that does that. So these are the kinds of questions I would ask if I was thinking about, how do democracy and education intersect beyond school age? If we're looking at this chart here, that would be, at the 18-year mark. And that could be either on the x-axis or the y-axis. It's probably around where the lines meet in the middle. So anywhere above or to the right of that middle line would be an adult. And what does it look like after that? What is the citizenship with the democracy and education intersection like in those different areas? So that's what we have to figure out. And that's what you are being asked to sort of ask and answer in our section on democracy and education beyond school age. In particular, thinking about not just the US citizens who were born in the country, but folks who might be immigrants or forced migrants from other countries coming into the United States. What is their citizenship? Is it political, social, or economic, or all three? What does it look like in terms of government-sponsored education, especially equitable education? That would be education that has that sort of democratic premise to it. Is it overt and formal? Is it voluntary and formal? Is it passive and informal? And then what would that look like in specific situations? If we were talking about literacy, if we were talking about higher education, if we were talking about just learning to be a good community member, or what my democratic rights and responsibilities are, whether or not I am a formal US citizen. All right, so when you figure that out, let me know. You've got some really interesting things to continue your discussion about this on your own. One is looking at this blog post by Dr. Kirksey and Dr. Satin Bajaj, looking at immigration policies and how those might influence the way that citizenship develops and what education looks like for those who are involved in, or maybe who are on the non-citizenship side of the law. There also is about an hour-long panel discussion for this group here, looking at different civic organizations' approaches to developing citizenship or civic awareness or civic culture in young adults, adults nonetheless, but young adults. And then in our class meeting, we're going to talk a little bit about mobility and what it means to become a citizen and what that looks like. Okay. If you have questions for me, certainly let me know. Otherwise, I will see you soon.